In this lecture, we'll be talking about similarities and differences among all of the sciences, and then categorical similarities and differences between natural sciences and the social and behavioral sciences. Now, to discuss our terms a little bit, natural sciences are the sciences that have as their subject matter aspects of the natural world, whereas social and behavioral sciences are sciences that have as their subject matter human beings and human society. And so the natural sciences would include things like physics, chemistry, biology, and geology, whereas the social behavioral sciences would include psychology, sociology, economics, and political science. And neither one of these lists is comprehensive. There are a lot of social and behavioral sciences, a lot of disciplines that would count as, that we'd want to lump together with social behavioral sciences, other than just these four. And of course there's plenty of natural sciences other than these four as well. So these are just sort of a representative sampling of the two disciplines. Now, there's a number of significant similarities among all of the sciences, social, behavioral, and natural. And these include things like all of them seek to explain aspects of the world, either of the natural world or the social world or of human behavior. All of them are empirical. All of them involve the need for observation. It's part of that's part of what makes all of them distinctive from other disciplines, is that they're reliant on observation in some form or another. All of them involve the formulation of hypotheses, and to some extent the testing of hypotheses. In all of them, it's important to have transparency. Now, I think almost any scientist, whether social or behavioral, and certainly almost all natural scientists, will tell you, if asked, that they're concerned about getting at what's really the truth of the matter, and that in conducting their research, what they want to find, what they'd like to find, what they value, isn't what drives their research. What they're interested in, they may have a preference between two hypotheses, but what's important is the evidence for the hypothesis, and it's important. And I think almost all scientists will tell you that having this attitude that they need to remain objective, whatever their preferences are, they need to take the evidence for what it is and to follow out their data where it leads. But now we know that it's one thing, I think everyone knows that it's one thing to say that you're objective and impartial and that you follow the evidence where it leads, but it's quite another to actually always successfully do so. And so this is where the importance of transparency comes in. And what we mean by transparency is that part of all of the sciences that you can discuss, whether it's economics or psychology or physics or chemistry or biology, in all of these sciences, it's important for the scientists to be able to explain their data, to explain their experiment, to explain their experimental setup. So that if any scientist who wants to publish her work is going to need to be able to clearly demonstrate how the experiment was set up and how her data was analyzed. And so this fact that in order to publish your work, you have to be transparent. You have to show your work in order to publish your work, is a strong institutional factor that we can add to the sort of attitudinal factor of objectivity among individual scientists. So what this means is that when you're trying to evaluate whether you should believe some scientific result, it's not necessarily the case that you have to rely on the scientists who came up with the results for being virtuous. It's not necessarily the case that I think we all know that it's not necessarily the case that all scientists are virtuous or all scientists are purely objective. Even some very virtuous scientists who really want to do a good job and really want to find out the truth may be influenced by their own desires or their own, to see one hypothesis proven correct or shown incorrect. But we don't have to in evaluating science, we don't have to take individual scientists by their word. We can look at the product of science as not just the product of individuals, where we can worry about the methods and objectivity of those individuals. We can take the products of science as being the products of an institution, as sort of a social product. And the institutions of science, if they're working the way they're supposed to, require transparency. And in requiring transparency, this sort of allows the institution of science to hopefully weed out bad data, weed out bad results. So if you're a scientist who isn't as objective as you should be, who you misinterpret your results for one reason or another, perhaps you're not being objective enough, or perhaps you're just perhaps you've just made some sort of mistake. The requirement of transparency, the requirement that once your work is published, that other scientists can look at how you did it and test your results and try to replicate your results, means that a lot of bad science, a lot of bad results aren't going to make it into the textbooks. They aren't going to succeed as justified knowledge. And so I think this is an important aspect that is easy to miss when you're looking at the scientific method. So when you look at the scientific method of collecting data and formulating hypotheses and testing hypotheses, this is all stuff that an individual scientist can do, right? This is science on the sort of the micro level. The scientific method is something that Robinson Crusoe, alone on his island, could conduct. But it's not clear that science as a whole is something that you can do as an individual. Many people who study science argue that transparency and institutional factors are what really give science its legitimacy as a source of knowledge. Because if the institutions of science are working the way they're supposed to, the picture is that in any given well-justified scientific result, you've had more than one scientist or more than one laboratory doing the experiment and testing the experiment. And in addition, you've had lots of scientists who aren't necessarily repeating the experiment, looking over the data and looking over the analysis. And this means that the final results, once something has been published in a journal and then the experiment has been repeated and published in another journal, it means that the scientist, the hypothesis can become increasingly well justified. Or if the original experiment was flawed, it means that experiment won't make it into the textbooks, won't become part of our overall field of scientific knowledge. Now, one last similarity that I think you can find among all the sciences is the use of models. Now here, I'm using model here as a very broad term, where a model can be any number of things. So some famous models in science include Watson and Crick's, perhaps the most famous 20th century model, Watson and Crick's model of DNA. Now the crucial thing about a model in science is that a model is supposed to represent some part of the world, but it isn't necessarily presented as a perfectly accurate representation of the world. A model can be very different from the part of the world that it's modeling, as long as it's like that part of the world in a crucial way. So for instance, in this physical model of DNA that Watson and Crick are looking at here, isn't at all like actual DNA in terms of size or in terms of color. but it's like DNA in the crucial sense of having the double helix structure. Another famous model in science would be this lovely picture of the Copernican model of the solar system. So it's unlike the actual solar system in that, last time I checked anyway, the sun doesn't have a mournful looking face on it. And the Earth isn't, bigger than the sun. But it's like it models the solar system in the crucial way of showing that the Earth goes around the sun rather than vice versa. Now, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, another type of model, a more abstract type of model, has become increasingly important, and that is mathematical models. Now, mathematical models, particularly mathematical models of very complex phenomena. Models of parts of the world that have lots of moving parts and lots of sort of extraneous factors. And the reason why this type of modeling has become more prominent in science in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st is computers. Mathematical models, very complex modeling is now made more possible by the use of our computing power. And so a number of fields use very complex models. So economics, there's mathematical models in economics. Very complex models are used in meteorology, and climate science. Complex models of cognition are used by psychologists. And with these very complex models, the hope is that it's always difficult to get everything in, right? Particularly when you're dealing with the weather. There's so many different things that can affect the weather. But the hope is that the science can build enough data into the model that it's useful at telling us how some part of the natural world works. And even more, and hopefully, and even more crucially, it might, if our models are good enough, they might allow us to predict what things that will happen in the natural world. So the use of models in this broad sense is a feature that you find, I think, throughout the sciences. But now, among the sciences, there's a number of significant differences as well. And we often, in thinking about sciences, I think particularly in thinking about natural sciences, there's really a tendency to look at physics and chemistry as sort of the ideal for what sciences should be. But it's worth noting, and also frequently, as I'll talk about in a moment, the social sciences are put in contrast to the natural sciences of physics and chemistry. But it's worth noting that not all sciences are exactly like physics and chemistry, and including not all natural sciences are exactly like physics and chemistry. There's a number of crucial differences among the sciences. And one difference is just a matter of where they take place. Some scientists do all their work in labs, and some scientists do all their work out in the field. So Michelson and Morley, in testing for the ether, did all their work in a laboratory. Charles Darwin, in coming up with a theory of natural selection, mostly did his work, mostly came up with his theory as a result of looking out in the natural world, including in his famous voyage of the Beagle in South America. And this brings us to another difference among the different sciences, is there's a number of different data gathering tools and techniques. So there's interferometers if you want to test the way light travels, the way Michelson and Morley did. If you're a social scientist, if you're a sociologist, your data gathering tool might be a survey. Your instrument for study would be a well-designed survey that you've passed out to enough people. If you study squid, your main, if you study tiny squid, your main data gathering tool might be a net. There's all sorts of different types of equipment and tools across the sciences that are used in service of gathering data. Another difference among sciences, and this is really where physics and chemistry seem to be sort of separated out from a lot of the other sciences, is the degree to which the theory enables prediction and the relevance of laws, or if you don't like the term laws of science, law-like generalizations. These are causal laws. So in physics and chemistry are sort of famous for enabling prediction and famous for having laws. So laws of motion in physics, the ideal gas law in chemistry. And often there's a fairly common view of science that this is the ideal, that what all sciences are working towards is the discovery of laws and law-like generalizations that will allow prediction. That is, many people see science, all sciences, as working towards a causal theory of the world, as working towards a discovery of the hidden causes for everything that happens in the world and the basic laws that govern everything that happens in the world. But it's not the case that all sciences are able to predict phenomena accurately, or that all sciences rely on a lot of laws. So, going back to our scientists studying squid, if you're a zoologist and an expert on squid, you may not discover a lot of laws of squid. You may not discover a lot of rules that you can use to predict things about squid. You may basically just discover, how squid work and where they live and that sort of thing. So there's a number of areas of both natural science and social science where the primary work seems to be describing the world without, and where there isn't much in the way of laws being discovered, and therefore there isn't much in the way of predictions being enabled. But now, as we've talked about with models, hopefully many scientists see the object of science as moving towards laws and moving towards the ability to predict what's going to happen in the natural world and what's going to happen in the social world. And a lot of modeling, a lot of the construction of models is aimed at prediction. And so now this might be prediction without laws. That is, if you build a good enough model of the weather or a good enough economic model, you might be able to tell what's going to happen in the markets or what's going to happen in the weather without having discovered any laws. You've just sort of simulated the world well enough. But it is the case that it's not the case that all natural sciences are like physics and chemistry. And it's certainly not the case that the social sciences are particularly like physics and chemistry in this regard. And this brings us to the question of, well, what other than the subject matter distinguishes the natural sciences from the social sciences? So an obvious difference is the sort of the definitional difference that we started with. The natural sciences study the natural world. Social behavioral sciences study people and behavior and society. So no one's going to disagree that there's this basic difference between natural sciences and social sciences. But there's an enormous amount of disagreement within the social and behavioral sciences about the appropriate methodology for social and behavioral sciences. And one major distinction is that one major divide within these sciences is the question of, well, are social behavioral sciences methodologically speaking the same as natural sciences? Or is the investigation of human beings and their relation to others something that requires a significantly different methodology than what's used in the natural sciences? So these are two sort of camps, if you will, in the social and behavioral sciences. On the one hand, you have the camp that says that, look, it may be the case now that social and behavioral sciences aren't much like physics and chemistry. We haven't discovered laws of behavior or laws of society or laws of economics. We're not very good at predicting. We can predict some things about human behavior and some things about social events and some things in the economy, but we're not really that good at predicting things yet. But this camp will say, but that doesn't suggest that we need to give up on the basic methodology that we use in the natural sciences. That doesn't mean that we need anything other than the scientific method or any emendation of the scientific method. That just means that maybe it's just the case that we're dealing with more complex phenomena, that what we have to study, our data is harder to gather and harder to interpret, or maybe it's just that the social and behavioral sciences are newer than the natural sciences. Looking at things like economics and sociology and a lot of psychology has just sort of been since the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century or so, that these disciplines sort of came into their own as distinct disciplines, as opposed to just being considered part of value theory and philosophy, part of just sort of general. It's fairly recent to regard the social sciences as being sciences at all, rather than branches of the humanities. And so maybe it's just that some combination of the complexity of the subject matter and the newness of the disciplines that leads to the fact that the social sciences haven't discovered much in the way of laws and don't really enable us to predict things the way the natural sciences, or at least certainly the natural sciences of physics and chemistry do. So that's one side. This side says, we need to limit ourselves to the scientific method. Our aim should be to make economics and sociology and biology empirical, experimental, observational disciplines in the same sense that physics and chemistry are. But then you have a whole other camp in the social and behavioral sciences who say that this is just wrong-headed, that studying human beings and studying human behavior and human society is just different in kind than studying the natural world. Not the least of which because human beings have minds. And when you're dealing with human minds, you're dealing with something that's just different in kind than dealing with causal forces out in the world. So this is a big debate. There's lots of different camps. The debate plays out differently in different disciplines. But I think there's a few sort of particular areas of controversy within the social sciences relevant to this debate that I think are worth covering in turn. And so there's 3 points of contention that I'm going to talk about today. The first is the distinction between reasons and causes. Now, it's often noted by historians of science that, in part, the great progress over the course of the centuries in the natural sciences is progress away from explaining the world in terms of reasons or purposes or goals, and towards explaining the world purely in terms of causal forces. So it used to be that the explanation for the weather was in terms of what supernatural forces wanted to accomplish with the weather, or the explanation of why the sun moved across the sky was in terms of what the sun wanted to do. And it's generally seen as a great part of the progress of the natural sciences to move away from these sort of intentional, purposive explanations, to move away from, use a big philosophy word, teleological explanations based on ends, based on goals that the natural world was moving towards. That a great part of the progress of the natural science has been accomplished by moving away from these kinds of explanations to moving towards what you might call more mechanistic explanations, moving towards explanations that to put it somewhat more poetically, that take the purpose and intent out of nature and understand nature as just one thing causing another in a mechanical way. And certainly you can see this in physics and chemistry. As physics and chemistry has progressed quite productively by understanding the world in terms of causal forces and sort of laws that govern all causal forces, rather than in terms of any particular intentions or functions that things in the natural world serve. Similarly for biology. Now, of course, in biology, there's a lot of talk about functions. There's a lot of talk about, well, this bird eats this food, has a beak that's constructed in this way because it allows them to open nuts, or this bird has this beak that fulfills the function of allowing it to catch fish. But certainly since Darwin, these kinds of functional explanations in biology are understood as not really being about the reason for why the bird has a beak that's shaped one way or the other. But rather, these kinds of explanations are understood as a sort of shorthand for a basically causal explanation. So anytime when a biologist says, well, this bird has this beak because it allows it to eat this kinds of seeds, that's just a shorthand for saying that there's some causal story of natural selection, where the causal forces of natural selection led to this particular type of beak evolving. So within the natural sciences, the move away from reasons, the move away from understanding things in terms of purposes and goals and intentions, and towards understanding things as a result of purely causal phenomena, has been a productive move. And for this reason, there's a number of social scientists who believe that the social sciences should proceed in the same manner, and that social sciences ought to be concerned with purely with causes and not with reasons. But in the social sciences, but then another camp in the social sciences would say that, well, look, you can't get away from reasons in the social sciences. I mean, the best explanation for why people do things is that they have reasons for doing things, and that if you're not looking at the reasons, if you're not looking at people's reasons for doing things, if you're not looking at the reasons for behavior or the reasons for social phenomena, you're just gonna miss the whole story. An illustration of this, an illustration of how this might actually play out in a social science, is consider that suppose that you're a sociologist, and it's come to your attention that there's an interesting sociological phenomena in, let's say southern Missouri, in the Ozarks in Missouri. There's two towns that aren't very far from each other, and these towns seem to be the same in most. They seem to be the same demographically. They're about the same size. They're in the same region. There doesn't seem to be any apparent differences between these two towns, and yet one of the towns has a far higher incidence of domestic violence than the other town. And so you're a social sociologist, and you decide that this is worth investigating. You're going to look into what makes the difference in these two towns. Now, there's a lot of possible causal factors you can look at. You can look at, you can see if you can find any difference in any nutritional differences in the two towns. You can see if you can find see if there's any, perhaps there's some sort of pollutant in one town or the other that affects behavior. You can look at the occupations that people have in these towns and see if there's anything relevant about those. So you can look for various causes of this increased rate of domestic violence. Okay. But then you might also interview people. You might also construct surveys. And in constructing surveys and interviewing people, you might be looking for something a little bit different than a cause. You might be looking for a difference in attitudes among different people. Now, a difference in attitude might be a reason. Differences in attitudes, or differences in, or sort of broader differences in the psychological states of people who live in these towns, or differences in the culture. Now, you might not want to call these causes in a direct sense, so much as reasons for why there may be more domestic violence in one town than in the next. But a number of social scientists are going to say that you need to look for reasons like this. You need to look for something beyond. You need to look for something beyond directly observable phenomena that have a sort of clear physical or testable implications to the phenomena you're studying. You need to look for something more abstract, more psychological. And this brings us to a second key point of contention within the social sciences. And this point of contention is between those who say that the social sciences ought to be like the natural sciences in that all data is gathered purely through observation, versus those who say that there's a manner of data gathering, there's a way of gathering data in the social sciences that's unique to the social sciences, and that is introspection. So looking back at our trying to find out why domestic violence is might be different in these two towns in the Ozarks, in trying to find reasons, part of, in terms of attitudes or cultural differences, in part what you may be doing in interviewing people is interviewing them and then trying to understand how certain kinds of attitudes or beliefs being, in some sense, in people's heads, how these attitudes and beliefs might lead to different kinds of behavior, how they might be reasons for different kinds of behavior. And this seems to require introspection. I mean, if you're interested in beliefs and intentions and attitudes and emotions, the way you learn about these, the main way we know about beliefs and intentions is through introspection, is through looking at our own minds. Now, we infer things about beliefs and intentions and attitudes in others, but we infer these things through others' behavior. That is, assuming you don't have ESP, which isn't part of the isn't an accepted part of, certainly not an accepted part of the scientific method. The only way you're going to have direct knowledge of beliefs and attitudes is through introspection on your own beliefs and attitudes. And any inference you make about other people's beliefs and attitudes is going to be an inference through behavior. So now, if you have the position that part of the goal of social science is to understand how beliefs, intentions, emotions, and attitudes are the reasons for social phenomena and behavioral phenomena, then it seems like you're going to need to accept that introspection has a role, at least in the gathering of data and the formulation of hypotheses. But now, there's a significant camp of social scientists who argue that introspection has no place. Introspection has no place in the social and behavioral sciences. And they say that a discussion of beliefs and intentions and emotions, explanations of phenomena in terms of beliefs, intentions, and emotions are operating according to what particularly these skeptical social scientists will call folk psychology. And they'll argue that folk psychology is not a productive way of explaining behavior. And that introspection shouldn't be part of our data gathering arsenal for the social scientists. After all, physicists and chemists don't use introspection, don't reflect on their own on their own minds in deciding what physical phenomena, how physical phenomena work, or doing testing on physical phenomena. And so the argument goes, nor should natural scientists, or nor should social scientists, I'm sorry. And so this role of introspection, even among psychologists. Now we often, I think a sort of traditional view of psychology is that, well, what isn't psychology all about beliefs and intentions and emotions? But there's a fairly strong camp of psychologists who argue that look, talk about beliefs and intentions and emotions and use of introspection hasn't been productive in psychology. That if we want a scientific theory of psychology that works essentially the way that physics and chemistry works, we need to take introspection out of our arsenal of data gathering tools. And what's left for the psychologists then? Well, there's several ways that several things that psychologists can do. They can focus exclusively on behavior without worrying about what's in the minds of the people behaving. They can just record behavior and look at how different people behave in reaction to different kinds of circumstances and given different kinds of stimulus. They can look at physiology. They can look at, there's nothing, they can use the tools of physiology towards the service of psychology. So they can try to basically understand the brain better than they currently do, and then through understanding the brain, understand human behavior and even possibly social behavior. And thirdly, they can use, as I discussed earlier in this video, they can use modeling. They can try to create computer models of how the brain might work, of how or of how what might be called intentional systems might work. So there are a lot of techniques that psychologists and social scientists might use that would allow them to learn more about human beings and human behavior that seem more consistent with the methodologies of the natural sciences than a study based on introspection. Of course, defenders of introspection are going to say that it's just implausible to think that we're going to be able to come up with sort of causal, law-like explanations of human behavior. They'll argue that, and this comes down to sort of a fundamental disagreement about what human beings are. This camp might say that, look, human beings aren't just physical systems. There's more to human beings, there's more to human minds than anything that the strictly tools that are strictly applicable to the natural world will be able to investigate. And if you refuse to use introspection, if you refuse to acknowledge that beliefs and intentions and reasons figure into human behavior, you're just not going to be able to understand human behavior. You're just going to be ignoring a crucial source of data. Okay. Now, a final point of contention, or a third point of contention within the social sciences, is the difference between holistic views of the subject matter of the social and behavioral sciences and reductive views. And what this means is, this distinction is that now in the natural sciences, this isn't completely uncontroversial in the natural sciences either, but many scientists have a picture of the natural sciences as basically looking at the same thing at different levels. So that physics looks at basic physical forces, chemistry looks at the operation of basic physical forces on matter, and biology looks at these chemical forces at a farther remove, various chemical forces working in a biological sense. Then ecology might look at the biological forces at a sort of even farther removed, taking it in an even bigger picture, but that ecology and biology and chemistry and physics all have basically the same subject matter, and that anything that you can understand in one of the broader views, in one of the broader disciplines, you can reduce to one of the narrower disciplines. So that ecology is basically can be reduced to biology, because the study of ecology is the study of various biological organisms working together. And there's no facts about ecology that aren't ultimately about these biological forces working together. Similarly, the study of biology can be reduced to chemistry, because looking at biological organisms, you're basically looking at organisms that are that can be understood in terms of their chemical forces, biochemical forces and mechanisms, and then chemistry could be reduced to physics, because chemistry is basically the study of physical laws operating on matter. So again, this isn't a completely uncontroversial view. This view that sciences are reducible into each other, and hopefully reducible into physics, the ultimate science of the ultimate physical laws of the world. But it's a fairly common view. And the questions of holism versus reduction are even more contentious in the social sciences. And so the question is, so I've touched on in discussing psychology, some psychologists, particularly those who think that psychology should ultimately be understood as having a methodology continuous with or no different from the methodology of the natural sciences, are going to say that ultimately what we're studying in psychology can be reduced to physiology. The behavior can be understood ultimately in terms of the physical workings of the brain, which can ultimately be understood in terms of chemical features of the brain, which ultimately can be understood in terms of physics. But then others in psychology would argue that this isn't, that beliefs and intentions and emotions simply can't be understood, can't be reduced in this way, that you can't understand the mental purely in terms of the physical. And this is why they would argue that introspection plays such an important role in psychology. Similarly, in sociology, there's a debate within sociology about whether there are social facts over and above individual psychological facts. So one of the early, most famous sociologists, Emil Durkheim, proposed that there is such a thing as a social fact that isn't reducible to a psychological fact, that societies, this is where the holism comes into, that societies as a whole have properties that aren't properties of simply properties of the individual parts of them. And this is an area of considerable debate within sociology. So these are just three, and I've only just barely, I think, touched on some pretty profound debates about what social sciences are and what social sciences should be, and sort of the direction of progress in the social sciences. But I hope that I've given you some sense of the real sort of contention within social science about exactly what social and behavioral science is, and exactly what it ought to be, and how much it is or isn't like the natural sciences.